Last winter, I decided to take a solo camping trip with my dog, Roscoe. A decision I've sworn I'll never repeat. I had taken a few days off work and felt an overwhelming need to disconnect from everything. No noise, no people, no distractions. Just the woods, the snow, and silence. I packed my truck with winter camping gear and drove deep into a remote state forest along a narrow trail that looked like it hadn't been properly maintained in years. The road was buried under packed snow and ice, and during the entire drive I didn't pass a single vehicle. After nearly an hour, I found a small pull-off area that looked abandoned and barely visible beneath layers of snow. I parked there, loaded my pack onto my shoulders, and began hiking with Roscoe. The walk took around 20 minutes. The deeper we went, the quieter the world became. Eventually, I found a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The snow there was untouched. No tracks, no signs of wildlife or people. It felt isolated in a way that was both peaceful and unsettling, but at the time it was exactly what I wanted. I dropped my pack and started setting up camp. Roscoe stayed close, occasionally bounding through the snow and sniffing the trees. I cleared a spot and pitched my tent, driving the stakes firmly into the frozen ground. Inside, I laid out my insulated sleeping pad and winter sleeping bag. I knew temperatures would drop well below freezing, so I layered my clothing carefully. Thermal base layers, heavy socks, fleece, and a thick jacket that I kept on even after finishing camp setup. Once everything was ready, I gathered fallen wood and built a small fire pit. I lit a fire and let it settle into a steady burn before cooking a simple dinner. I sat on a fallen log while eating, with Roscoe lying beside the warmth of the flames. The forest was eerily quiet. Snow has a way of absorbing sound, something my father taught me when I was younger. It created a silence so deep that even small movements felt amplified. After finishing dinner, Roscoe suddenly jumped to his feet and began barking toward the trees. At first, I didn't worry. Deer were common in that area, and he had barked at them before. I told him to calm down, and after about a minute, he relaxed and sat again. I checked the time and decided to enjoy the fire a little longer before heading into the tent. Like always, when camping in isolated places, I carried a handgun holstered at my side. At that moment, I felt completely safe. About 20 minutes later, Roscoe barked again, louder and more aggressive this time. Then I heard something myself. Footsteps. They crunched through the snow somewhere in the darkness of the forest. I stood slowly, listening. The footsteps stopped, then resumed. Roscoe shifted from barking to low growling before going completely silent. He stood stiff, staring directly toward the tree line. That was when I felt the first wave of real unease. Following his gaze, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trees, partially hidden in darkness and faintly illuminated by the firelight. My heart began pounding as I called out, telling the person he startled me while reassuring Roscoe that everything was fine. The figure didn't respond immediately. After a few seconds, he stepped forward just enough for me to see that he was a man. He asked what I was doing that deep in the woods. His voice wasn't aggressive, but it definitely wasn't friendly either. I told him I was camping with my dog and just wanted to spend time in nature. He said nothing. He just stared. The silence between us felt wrong, heavy, uncomfortable, and tense. I calmly told him that I was armed. He let out a small laugh and said something about how I was threatening him instead of welcoming him. He sarcastically questioned my hospitality, then turned around and disappeared back into the darkness. His footsteps faded until I couldn't hear them anymore. I stood there for several minutes afterward, staring into the woods. Roscoe stayed pressed against my leg. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right, but eventually I convinced myself the man had left. I extinguished the fire carefully, burying it in snow and stirring the ashes until no glow remained. I didn't want any light attracting attention. Then I climbed into my tent and sealed it tightly. Inside, I focused on staying warm. I placed my sleeping pad beneath me to block the frozen ground from draining body heat. I kept all my layers on, pulled a knit hat over my head, and tightened my sleeping bag around my shoulders. I placed hand warmers near my chest and feet. Roscoe curled against me, his body heat helping more than anything else. I lay there listening, or rather listening to the absence of sound. After some time, Roscoe began growling again. Seconds later, I heard it. Footsteps. They moved slowly through the snow. They stopped. Roscoe quieted but remained alert, ears pointed forward. Then the footsteps resumed. Closer this time. Slower. More deliberate. They approached the tent and stopped right outside. Roscoe began howling loudly. I whispered desperately for him to stop, terrified he might provoke whoever was outside. He eventually quieted but continued growling low in his throat. The person stood there. I could hear faint movements like shifting weight pressing into the snow. My hand gripped my gun, but I hesitated. I didn't want to threaten anyone, and I definitely didn't want to be forced into using it. I had never shot a person before and couldn't imagine taking someone's life, even to defend my own. Eventually, fear overcame hesitation. I cocked the gun loudly and announced that I was armed and that whoever was outside needed to leave immediately. Deep down, I already knew it had to be the same man. There was silence. Then footsteps began again, slowly retreating from the tent. They faded at first, then quickened before disappearing entirely into the woods. I never opened the tent to check. I stayed frozen for hours. Roscoe remained alert beside me, which was the only reason I eventually managed to drift into short, broken sleep cycles. If I had been alone, I don't think I would have slept at all. The moment the sky began to brighten, I packed everything as fast as possible. At sunrise, Roscoe and I hiked back to the truck and left without stopping. I never returned to that forest, and I never planned to. Encounters like that remind you how vulnerable you truly are in isolated places, and how quickly a peaceful escape can become something terrifying. During the 4th of July weekend in 2025, I decided to take a short trip from Melbourne, Florida to Charleston, South Carolina, to visit my friend Mark. We hadn't seen each other in years. He was completing an internship for his law program and was temporarily staying in a house in the city. I planned to stay the entire weekend, sleeping downstairs on a couch positioned near a set of windows that overlooked another apartment building, several narrow alleyways, and an abandoned house across the street. The drive to Charleston was smooth and uneventful. I arrived in the afternoon, and Mark and I spent the rest of the day catching up. Before sunset, we went out to play pickleball, something he had recently gotten into. Afterward, we returned to the house, talked for hours, and eventually went to bed. I settled onto the couch downstairs, enjoying the city lights outside the windows before drifting off to sleep. The following day, we spent the morning playing more pickleball and relaxing around town. Later, we decided to visit the Charleston City Market, one of the most popular tourist spots in the area. The market was crowded and lively, filled with vendors, music, and tourists exploring the historic location. After walking through rows of shops and stands, we eventually exited near the docks along the waterfront. That was when we saw him. A man dressed in a formal wedding suit was slowly shuffling along the road near the water. He wore polished dress shoes, a perfectly pressed suit, and a crisp bow tie. His appearance looked completely formal and oddly pristine, especially considering the humid summer heat and the busy tourist environment. He had long, black curly hair and a tan complexion, and despite the crowd behind us, he moved entirely alone. There was something unnatural about the way he walked. His movements were slow and disconnected, almost like he was sleepwalking through reality. He didn't seem to acknowledge the people around him, nor did he appear aware of his surroundings. If Mark and I had crossed the street, we would have walked directly toward him. Instinctively, I grabbed Mark's arm and told him we should avoid crossing. Without fully understanding why, I felt an immediate sense of discomfort. We turned right and walked deeper into the city, increasing our pace slightly. I told Mark how strange the man looked, pointing out how clean and carefully put together his clothes were. He didn't resemble someone homeless or intoxicated. Mark agreed that something about him felt off, though neither of us could explain why. We continued exploring the city for quite a while. Several streets later, while walking along another busy area filled with shops and restaurants, I glanced down the road toward a storefront and felt my stomach drop. It was him again. The same man in the exact same wedding suit stood diagonally across the street from us, moving with the same slow, detached stride. He was in a completely different part of the city, somewhere he logically couldn't have reached before us, especially considering how slowly he walked and how many turns we had taken. I pointed him out to Mark, and both of us stopped walking momentarily, watching him in confusion. Neither of us could explain how he had appeared there. After a few moments, we tried to brush it off and continued our day, though an uneasy feeling lingered in the back of my mind. The next day was July 4th. That night, we traveled to a nearby island about 20 minutes outside the city to watch the fireworks display. By that point, we had mostly forgotten about the strange man, convincing ourselves that he was simply an unusual local or perhaps someone struggling with personal issues. The following evening, July 5th, was my final night in Charleston. The city was packed with tourists and locals enjoying the weekend atmosphere. Historic buildings glowed under streetlights, restaurants overflowed with customers, and live music echoed throughout the streets. Mark and I had already scheduled a ghost tour for that night, something Charleston is well known for. After completing the tour, we walked through one of the busiest sections of the city nightlife. Crowds moved along the sidewalks and streets, creating waves of foot traffic flowing in every direction. As one large group approached us, Mark and I noticed something at the exact same moment. The man in the wedding suit stood in the middle of the crowd. He moved with that same slow, unnatural shuffling motion while everyone else walked normally around him. He stood out instantly, as if someone had inserted him into the crowd without him truly belonging there. Two people walked directly beside him, and he brushed between them without either person reacting or even acknowledging his presence. It was deeply unsettling. For a brief second, he turned his head and glanced directly at us. Then he continued forward without breaking his pace. It felt as if he was attached to the flow of people without actually being part of it. Mark and I stared at each other, both visibly shaken. Neither of us panicked, but we both felt a heavy sense of wrongness that neither of us could explain logically. We continued watching him as he drifted further down the street. When the crowd thinned, he became more visible again, still moving at that same strange speed. Eventually, he turned down a darker side street and disappeared around a corner. We didn't say much after that. We both knew what we had seen, and neither of us had an explanation. Later that night, we returned to Mark's house. He went upstairs to his room while I settled onto the couch downstairs again. I closed the blinds and eventually fell asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke suddenly to a faint tapping sound against the window. I froze completely. After several seconds, I slowly lifted the blind just enough to peek outside toward the alleyways. At the far end of the alley, I saw the back of a man turning the corner. Even from that distance, I recognized him instantly. It was the same man. Right before he disappeared around the corner, he turned his head slightly and looked back toward the window, toward me. The next morning, I told Mark everything I saw. He listened carefully, and despite being extremely logical and skeptical about anything supernatural, he admitted that the entire experience disturbed him deeply. The repeated appearances, the identical clothing, the unnatural movement. None of it made sense. For me, the encounter lingered even more. I tend to be more sensitive to strange or unexplainable experiences, and that weekend stayed with me long after I returned home. On July 6th, I drove back to Florida, but the image of the man in the wedding suit turning that final corner still lives in my mind, Neither Mark nor I have ever been able to explain who he was, or how he kept appearing exactly where we were, over and over again. I never used to be the kind of person who double-checked whether doors were locked or memorized the small, familiar sounds my house made at night. I lived alone in a small home that I had purchased a few years earlier, and my life followed a quiet, predictable routine. I worked remotely from home, ordered groceries most of the time, and usually went to the gym late at night when it was nearly empty. I didn't talk to my neighbors much, and honestly, I liked it that way. That routine was exactly why it took me longer than it should have to realize something was very wrong. It started one Tuesday night during winter. Around 2:30 in the morning, I was half asleep on my couch with the television playing softly in the background when I heard a dull thump near the back of the house. It wasn't loud or alarming. My first thought was that something in the kitchen had shifted or fallen over. Houses make strange noises sometimes, especially older ones, and I had heard similar sounds before. I muted the television and listened carefully. After a few seconds of silence, nothing else happened. I eventually got up, walked to the back door, and checked that it was locked. Everything looked normal, so I shrugged it off and went to bed. The next morning, when I opened the back door to take out some trash, I noticed something strange. The deadbolt still worked properly, but the door handle felt slightly loose, like it had been twisted or forced harder than usual. I made a mental note to fix it later, assuming it was just wear and tear. That same night, I went to the gym around 11 p.m. like I usually did. I enjoyed working out when the place was quiet. I returned home sometime between midnight and 12:30 a.m. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed my porch light was turned off. I always left that light on. I sat in my car for several seconds, trying to remember if I had turned it off before leaving. Eventually, I convinced myself that I probably had and simply didn't remember. Inside, everything appeared completely normal. Still, I walked through each room quickly, doing what felt like a harmless check, something I had never done before. After that, I went to bed. The following morning, I woke up to my alarm and noticed my phone battery was at only 12%. That immediately confused me because I always charged my phone overnight. The charging cable was still connected to my phone, but the wall charger had been unplugged from the outlet. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out how that could have happened. I told myself that maybe I had picked up my phone while half asleep and accidentally pulled the charger out without realizing it. That explanation didn't make much sense though, because my phone was still resting neatly on my nightstand, not tangled in my blankets. After that, I started paying closer attention to things around the house. That night, instead of going to sleep early, I stayed awake longer than usual, sitting in the dark with the television turned off, listening carefully to the sounds of the house. Around 3 a.m., I heard slow, dull thumps coming from somewhere near the back of the house. My first thought was footsteps, but I immediately tried to dismiss that idea as paranoia. I held my breath and listened, but the sound stopped after a few seconds. Eventually, I convinced myself the noise came from outside. I lived in a suburban neighborhood, and it wasn't impossible for someone to be walking around late at night. The next day, however, everything changed. When I walked into the kitchen, I noticed muddy footprints on the floor near the back door. The prints weren't clear or distinct. It almost looked like someone had tried to wipe mud off their shoes before walking inside, leaving faint, smeared impressions across the floor. My stomach dropped. I stood there staring at the marks, trying to rationalize how they could have appeared. I hadn't invited anyone over. I hadn't gone outside in muddy shoes. I checked the back door again and noticed faint scratch marks near the lock, as if someone had attempted to pry it open using something thin. That was when fear began creeping in. I called a locksmith later that afternoon and told him I suspected the lock was malfunctioning. I didn't mention the footprints or my suspicions because I didn't want to sound irrational. He replaced the lock and assured me everything was secure. That night, I pushed a chair under the back door handle and locked my bedroom door before going to sleep, something I had never done before. I woke up just before 4 a.m. to the sound of faint tapping on my bedroom door. It wasn't a knock. It sounded like someone lightly testing the surface of the door with their fingertips. I lay perfectly still in bed, staring at the door, my eyes burning because I refused to blink. After about a minute, the tapping stopped, and I heard soft footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, the chair was still wedged under the back door handle, but the door itself was unlocked. The new lock wasn't damaged. It had simply been turned from the inside. That was when reality hit me. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been inside my house while I was sleeping. I called the police and tried to explain the situation without sounding hysterical. Officers arrived, searched the house and yard, but found no signs of forced entry. They suggested I might have unlocked the door myself without remembering. I knew that wasn't possible, but there was nothing they could do without evidence. That night, I refused to sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with every light in the house turned on and a kitchen knife placed in front of me. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement coming from the basement. The basement door, located just off the kitchen hallway, was slightly open. A wave of dread washed over me. I slowly approached the door and peered through the small opening. At the bottom of the basement stairs, I saw the silhouette of someone standing there. I couldn't tell if they were looking up at me or simply standing still in the darkness. The moment I realized what I was seeing, I slammed the door shut and ran out of the house, sprinting to my car. I immediately called 911 again and waited outside until police arrived. This time, they entered the house while I waited in the back seat of a patrol car. Within minutes, they escorted a man out of my house in handcuffs. He was barefoot and dressed in dark clothing that looked dirty and slept in. He never looked at me once. While additional officers searched the house, one officer asked how long I had lived there and what my daily routine was, including when I typically went to the gym. They eventually told me they had discovered food wrappers, bottled water, and a phone charger plugged into an outlet behind the furnace in the basement. It appeared the man had been sleeping on the concrete floor using old insulation as padding. He had been living inside my house. Days later, while scrolling through my phone to send a photo to a friend, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a photograph of me sleeping in my bed taken at 3:11 a.m. On the same night, I woke up to my phone unplugged from the wall. I immediately contacted the police and transferred the image to them as evidence. They told me the photograph would likely add additional charges, including stalking, and could potentially require him to register as a sex offender for life. Even knowing he was caught didn't erase the trauma. To this day, I cannot go into a basement alone at night, and I never feel completely safe inside my own home anymore.